Alright guys, so Christmas is over but the sanctions aren't over yet. If you think 2023 was bad, more dollar weaponization is coming. So far, we have seen the freezing of Russian assets and the EU moving to use them. Then was the oil price cap meant to crush revenues. But in 2024, we are going to see a dangerous new financial sanction that even the West feels is risky. In our lead story today, Bank of Russia governor says she is bracing for more sanctions. She's preparing for more financial tsunamis coming for Russia, and there's a scramble to secure the economy. The West isn't done with punishing Russia just yet. So far, Russia's banking system has been holding up, it has been going strong. It hasn't really collapsed under the weight of all the Western sanctions. Recall how banks really make their money, right? It's the same in Russia, the US, or even in China as well. Banking revenues come from issuing loans to businesses and consumers. So if the real economy is growing, banks will be lending and profits will be growing. It's more or less the same everywhere. In the first 9 months of this year, Russian banks saw record profit that set a new all-time high. Last year, Western sanctions hit the banks, so the sector did see a collapse in profits. Getting cut away from the SWIFT system was a big one. However, there's a big rebound this year after the banks readjusted. The Russian economy has decoupled with Europe and the West and is closely working with China today. So there's still a growing demand for loans. It's the same situation as the oil sanctions, right? Initially, there will be a shock period where things seem to work. Revenues take an initial hit and the West, they all celebrate. Then Russia turns the tables and somehow they emerge stronger. To collapse the Russian banks, the G7 will need to take down the entire Russian economy, but that is next to impossible. China and Russia, they are now one economic unit today. So unless Beijing crashes, the sanctions will be rather limited in nature. But the West, they're still going to try, right? And the next one will be a big one. The US is turning to risky bank sanctions to deny money to Moscow. The previous punishments didn't work, so the US Treasury is moving to use secondary sanctions now. Let's talk a bit about secondary sanctions, right? Remember the freezing of Russian central bank assets and Europe cutting away Russian gas? Well, those are the primary sanctions against an entire country. Secondary sanctions are quite different. It targets individual companies, and in this case, it is targeting banks and financial institutions. Janet Yellen is coming on her one horse open sleigh. She's making a list and she's checking it twice, and she's going to figure out who has been naughty or nice. According to the Treasury, they will be using sanctions against banks that facilitate deals with Russia. This includes procuring semiconductors and ball bearings, equipment necessary for the war machine. But here's the kicker: Yellen could punish the banks even if they aren't aware of any wrongdoing. So once again, guys, we are entering into twilight zone where things could really backfire badly. And let's be clear here, it's not being imposed on Russian banks. Those banks have already been sanctioned to oblivion. This is a blanket sanction targeting all global banks, including American ones on Wall Street as well. So you can see how tricky this really is. By doing this, you are indirectly weaponizing the US banking system to try and break Russia again. And just like the price caps or the dollar sanctions, there could be a nasty blowback effect. And listen to this warning: if you sanction a foreign financial institution or fine a US bank for doing business with them, that can have a lot of ripple effects. And this is coming from a former US Treasury official. Even he knows what Janet Yellen is planning is dangerous. There are a ton of unintended consequences. So if you are a bank in Dubai, Hong Kong, or even in America, US sanctions can cut you away. This will be interesting because the world relies on dollars to function. If banks get cut away from the Western system, they will lose access to dollar funding and even access to SWIFT as well. Essentially, the US is giving them a deadly choice: either do business with Russia or you can keep your access to the global financial system. All of these companies still have to use the financial system. This statement is coming from the US Treasury itself, so they know exactly what they are doing. It's weaponizing the entire global financial system that revolves around the US dollar. Alright, in the short term, this might indeed work. By throwing out such a broad net with loose definitions, right, that could spook out banks and force compliance. However, this might also cause Wall Street to abandon entire sectors and many countries will start moving away further from the dollar system. This is only going to encourage further bilateral trade outside of the reserve currency. You'll force the global south to build an alternative system. But here's where things get really tricky, right? Will America sanction Chinese banks that are doing business with Russia? What will this do to US-China relations as well? So you can see how interconnected this whole mess is. But America probably has little choice because they are running out of options. Russia has committed to spending a record amount of money to fight Ukraine in 2024. It's a 70% budget increase to $157 billion. That is a ton of money that can be used to bankroll soldiers and pay for armaments. However, it's a completely different story in the West. There's still no approval in Congress for Biden's $60 billion to Ukraine, and this will drag on to 2024 and even longer thanks to the border policy. In the EU, Hungary is also blocking the 50 billion euro package, so the West is tightening whatever screws they can get their hands on, and the hope once again is to starve vital supplies to Russia to stop the war. Now, in 2024, global banks will be fair game. Jake Sullivan has made it abundantly clear to the world that either you are with us or you are against us. We are sending an unmistakable message. Anyone supporting Russia's unlawful war effort is at risk of losing access to the US financial system. Now, will this work? It probably will in the short term. Global banks can't afford to lose access to the US dollar system. It's just too entrenched in our economy. According to the BIS, the dollar is involved in 90% of foreign exchange transactions, half of global trade, and 75% of Asia Pacific trade is denominated in US dollars. For most banks, losing access to this will be unthinkable. If they can't transact in dollars, they'll be cut away from financing global trade. But in the long term, it will backfire and prompt the world to ditch the Western financial system a little faster. Let's talk about the sanctions on Russian energy as well. And this is another example of how things might seem horrible at first. America sanctioned Russia's Arctic LNG 2 project, which is about to start production. Now, this is a big target because by unlocking Arctic energy, Russia gets to increase their revenue and control a bigger size of the LNG market. Obviously, the US doesn't want that to happen. Because of this, all the foreign shareholders of the project are now spooked out. This includes Total Energies from France, Japan's Mitsui, and even China. They are now afraid of the US sanctions. Each of them have a 10% stake in the project. Plus, they also can't offtake LNG from the Arctic 2 now. From Reuters, foreign shareholders freeze participation in Russia's Arctic LNG 2. The companies above are renouncing their responsibilities because of US sanctions. And that means they won't be financing the project and likely will be abandoning their offtake contracts. So Russia's Arctic LNG sales are now affected as well. Obviously, this isn't good news for Russia. It hits the project with more delays. And here's how critical the project is. It is a key element in Russia's drive to increase its LNG market share from 8% to 20% by 2030. By imposing sanctions, America is doing two things. Now, on the surface, this reduces Russian revenues for sure. They can sell less LNG. But this also prevents Russia from winning greater market share and increases reliance on US LNG instead. So if you're Japan and you can't buy Arctic LNG from Russia, where do you go instead? You'll probably head to the United States for your supply. America still has many tricks up their sleeve that we can't ignore. And I want to emphasize that these sanctions reinforce how everything can be weaponized. It's not just the US dollar but energy itself as well. OPEC, they did it before by cutting production, but now the US is using their LNG supply to enforce their sanctions. According to the EIA, US LNG exports have been increasing year after year. Exports are projected to hit nearly 16 billion cubic feet per day. Their production boom has exceeded even Australia and Qatar. And this makes America the top LNG exporter in the world in 2023. Because of this, America has huge leverage to control countries that import LNG from them. Even China is now seeking exemptions from US sanctions on Russian LNG. Because Beijing still buys LNG from the US, there's always a risk of getting cut away from their American supply. Now, obviously, China doesn't want to do this, but in the short term, the threat is real. The threat of sanctions is giving them a big headache. But in the long run, this isn't good because Russia will eventually develop the Arctic 2 project themselves and get a bigger share of the profits. Countries like China will also start to move away from US LNG. It will take some time, but there will be a shift away. And one perfect example just happened. From Bloomberg, the Chinese Yuan topped Japan's yen in share of global currency payments. China's currency have taken the fourth spot for the first time in November. In other words, more yuan is being used in global payments in the SWIFT system rather than the yen. And this is big because the yen is supposed to be a reserve currency right after the dollar and the euro. So why has it lost the bronze medal? We can see this big spike up in global usage of yuan in the SWIFT. It went parabolic in November last month, hitting 4.6% of market share. But notice the big trend since the start of the year. This was when Russia and China started to push back against the dollar. They started pricing exports and commodities in the Chinese yuan. To access Russian oil and Chinese goods, you are encouraged to pay in yuan and not the US dollar. Remember, there's always a lag effect to everything, right? Just like how it takes time for interest rates to destroy demand, de-dollarization also takes time. In fact, it takes a much longer time, but we are already seeing things move. We can already see things start to manifest. Comparing the SWIFT market share, the next currency at risk of being dethroned is the British pound. The pound comes in at 7.2% market share, which is just a few percentage points away from the yuan being able to compete. The more the West imposes sanctions, the more the world will try to break free from using Western currencies. The more you transact in dollars, euros, and even pounds, the more you are beholden to the current system. Now, back in March, Putin supported the Chinese yuan in a speech. We support using Chinese yuan in transactions between the Russian Federation and their partners in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And he's talking about promoting the yuan in their global commodity trade with the global south, right? We have said before that the easiest way for de-dollarization is in bilateral trade, and this is already yielding results. Analyzing the SWIFT data again, something else just happened. The yuan has surpassed the euro in trade finance market at 5.7%. It is now number 2 in the world with the dollar as number 1. And this means more yuan is being used to facilitate global trade versus the euro. More instruments like letters of credit and trade invoicing are being done in the Chinese currency. And this is groundbreaking, guys. I'm not saying that the yuan will suddenly hit 20% in SWIFT next year or overtake the US dollar. Those won't happen. And people tend to go to the extremes with these conversations. But this is a clear evidence that the world is starting to split apart into two different poles. The Western financial system is clearly being weaponized today, so alternative currencies and systems, they are all starting to rise. This might take years and decades to fully manifest, but it can't be stopped. The train has left the station. The chance of any reversal is slim to none, and Slim has left the building. So here's the deal. More sanctions are coming for Russia, and this economic war is far from over. Last year, it was the US dollar sanctions. This year, it was the price caps on Russian oil. And next year, it will affect the global banking sector as well. And as we go up the sanctions escalator, the boomerang effects will escalate as well. Going into 2024, we'll likely see Russia and China ramp up their efforts to move away from the West, and this will continue with their bilateral trade. China-Russia trade has soared in the past 2 years. The total amount of exports and imports has reached nearly $220 billion. This is a big amount of trade that will continue bypassing the US dollar in their transactions. Every time the West imposes more sanctions, it just drives China and Russia closer and closer together. It achieves the opposite effect, and here's how crazy things have really become. 90% of trade between Russia and China is now being done either in the ruble or the Chinese yuan. That's almost full de-dollarization between both nations. And by 2024, this could hit nearly 100%. It won't be a surprise anymore. Every action has a reaction. America might start sanctioning global banks tomorrow, but there are a ton of things that can go wrong. There are 101 ways of things backfiring. However, it's not going to stop. Because the dollar is the world reserve currency, America can still impose more sanctions well into 2024. So hang tight, guys, because next year is going to be crazier. It's going to be wilder. Nothing is off the table and anything is truly possible. But let me know what you think, guys. Will the sanctions on global banks hurt Russia or backfire badly? And is this a bridge too far? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe. Be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.